Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back to this 2025 federal election special podcast, which is going to be a bit light on for content for the obvious reason that the major political parties and most of the media seem to be colluding to make absolutely certain that not a single word is spoken about AUKUS, and particularly that part of it relating to nuclear-powered submarines, nor about US President Donald Trump destroying the international trading system, which will have huge consequences for Australia. Now, in federal election campaigns, it has become the norm for ministers and their counterparts to have televised debates at the National Press Club and followed by questions from journalists. And so far, in this campaign, we have had ministers for housing, health, the Treasurer, maybe some others, all having debates with their shadow counterparts. The Prime Minister has debated Peter Dutton 3 times, and so the electorate now has a fairly good understanding of what they stand for and what sort of people they are. But guess who is missing from that list? Class, today's question: who has not debated? Any answers? Which senior minister in charge of a very important portfolio is too scared to show his face in front of a live audience and take on his opposite number? Why, that would be Richard Marles, supposedly our defence minister, who doesn't want to debate Andrew Hastie, and as far as anyone can tell, that's actually something that Hastie himself is equally happy about. Well, what's going on? What is happening is not that they are scared to debate each other, they are both scared of being put on the spot by nosy journalists, such as me, on a variety of AUKUS-related questions, such as why are we handing over billions of dollars, total of 10 billion to be precise, to US and UK companies without a refund clause? What do we do if no submarines are sold to us by the US? Now, I won't go through the entire list because regular listeners have heard it many times before. The only bright spot in some of this otherwise uneventful campaign was Andrew Hastie, who finally, belatedly, told the media while announcing the opposition's defence policy, more on that in a moment, that the US under President Trump is no longer a reliable ally and that Australia has to become more self-reliant. I thought this was an amazing hallelujah moment in politics, with someone, anyone really, stating the bleeding obvious that the new willingness of the US to stab former allies in the back must affect Australia's strategic outlook. To make sure his remarks could not be ignored, he repeated them a couple of hours later to the ABC's Patricia Karvelis, the afternoon briefing program, and I was so excited by this development that I sent the following text to a friend who is, how do I put it, an extremely close observer of the defence ecosystem. And my text read, "Maybe the dam of stupidity has finally cracked and is about to unleash a flood of common sense." To which I received the droll and ultimately accurate reply, "I love your optimism, young man." Now, after Andrew Hastie, Karvelis next asked Science Minister Ed Husic, who I've always liked for a variety of reasons, and Ed, even though it wasn't his portfolio, he also said, yes, obviously Australia has to become more self-reliant. And I thought, wow, amazingly, we're now going to have some sort of sensible national debate about what's going on. However, the only journalist who picked up on this very worthwhile development was ABC defence reporting dynamo Andrew Green. It was, as far as I can tell, totally ignored by everyone else. And here we are, with no one in the mainstream media or in federal politics prepared to accept the new reality that the world has changed and is a far more dangerous and less certain place. The US is positioning itself as an ally of Russia and various other authoritarian regimes. Allies are being abandoned and hit with tariffs, including, of course, Australia. We are living in the year 2025 and not 1955. And it's so frustrating when our political leaders refuse to acknowledge the new reality. Things won't go back to normal, and Australia has to ready ourselves for a much less certain world. Let's look at what is being offered by the two sides. From the government, nothing. By which I mean nothing in addition to small funding increases eaten up by inflation, with a vague promise to lift defence expenditure to 2.3% of GDP later in the decade. But note, all of this extra funding, and it's not a lot, is only for two things: nuclear-powered submarines and general-purpose frigates. From the opposition, there has been surprisingly little detail about their defence policy, other than a fourth squadron of F-35s, which they announced several weeks ago, and a 5-year increase in funding to 2.5% of GDP, and then an aspirational target of going to 3% over a 10-year period. Very disappointing for 3 years in opposition. Normally in opposition, you of course use that time to formulate credible alternate policies, but it would appear that Mr. Hastie and his colleagues have done absolutely nothing for that entire 3-year period. So here are some of my own ideas. I'm going to do the work of Mr. Hastie and the opposition and part of the government for them. First of all, number one, convert our 2 Canberra-class LHDs into small aircraft carriers, each embarking 12 F-35Bs. Now, this can be done. For people who, in fact, be done quite easily. I wrote an article for the Australian newspaper for one of their recent supplements, going through that in some detail. There has been this myth around, perpetrated by the Royal Australian Navy, that it's too difficult to convert the LHDs for F-35B operations. No, it is not, and I can go into a lot more factual detail about that in the future. So it can be done. The work on the ships, some structural work is needed, not a great deal. That can be done in Australia. The ships don't have to go into dry dock. It can be done while they're tied alongside. F-35Bs can be ordered easily, and I think there are some gaps in the production line, so they could arrive in Australia relatively quickly. So 24 F-35Bs. Personally, I'd add another 6, because sometimes they can be useful for some land-based applications in support of army operations. So that's number one. Now, there is still time, and this is another one of my hobby horses, to start building missile-equipped corvettes at Henderson using the existing Arafura supply chain. 2,200-ton corvettes, 16 VLS cells each. Now, to get really creative, I'd equip them with surface-to-air missiles from South Korea, but with all of the missiles built in Australia, because South Korea can do that. I'll come back to that. Speaking of South Korea, third, take them up on their extraordinarily generous offer to co-develop a low Earth orbit satellite-based communications network for the ADF. You can read the details in the current edition of Asia Pacific Defence Reporter, the May edition. There's another article there going into some detail of what South Korea is proposing. And why is defence not grabbing this offer with both hands? Now, number 4 on my list, reinstate Air 7003 and start purchasing Predator B armed drones. A lot of the work has already been done supporting this capability in Australia, and prime contractor General Atomics could dust off the plans. The version that we were going to get and still can get is the one that the Royal Air Force is getting. They would be delighted to support Australia. The UK government would be delighted to support it. And it comes with UK weapons, not US weapons, which is part of my theme. We have to diversify our sources of supply. Number 5 on the list, look at retiring the Hawk lead-in fighters and replacing them with a large number of much more capable training light attack aircraft, such as Korea's FA-50 family or Leonardo's impressive M346 advanced jet trainers. And the final one on this very brief list, there are a whole lot of other things, but just to simplify, reinstate the number of infantry fighting vehicles to 450 and self-propelled howitzers to 60. cut because of the Defence Strategic Review. Hanwha Defence made the decision to establish their vehicle centre of excellence outside of Geelong in the electorate of Richard Marles, based on the original orders of 450 and 60 SPHs. Easy to reinstate that. Now, this has to be accompanied by major departmental reform, particularly reinstating internal contestability, and most importantly of all, get ministers and their staff completely out of military promotion, and let's please get back to a system of promotion on ability and not promotion dependent on who is best at kissing backside. Now, if all of that happens, Australia will fairly quickly ramp up to 3% of GDP and have a far more robust military than we have now. And sometimes people say, well, where should the money come from? I'm not an economist, but I'm not going to dodge the question. Well, obviously, the tax system needs an overhaul where big multinational energy exporters need to pay their way. I would start with that. Now, deep breath having gone through my wish list. Now, careful observers will note that South Korea features prominently on this list, and as regular readers and listeners know, this is a recurrent theme of mine because the country has a huge amount of industrial capacity, and unlike many countries, but especially the US, they will transfer technology and actively help us build things here. And the South Koreans like us. I'm not entirely sure why. I mean, some of it goes back to the Korean War, and they're still very grateful for Australian assistance. Also, Australia clearly is a source of important raw materials and energy for them. And over the years, I've watched a succession of, South Korean officials sending out the signals pretty obviously that they are prepared to help us, and they're just not getting much traction, because the entire defence ecosystem remains so terribly wedded to everything going on in the United States. I'm coming back to an earlier theme where I'm hoping that Donald Trump has done us a favour by making it clear that we are on our own. But getting back to the election campaign, because I'm meant to be spending some of my time talking about that, what are people actually discussing? I've tuned out of a lot of it, I have to say. Now, to find a partial answer to this question, I turn to the Guardian newspaper, the Monday edition. Yes, I know that it's a Leninist propaganda sheet, but they promised an extensive article analysing all of the really important issues not being discussed. Okay? Now, their list is: where next to the Voice referendum? Fair enough. A gambling ad ban? What's happening with that? Protecting the barrier reef? Yes. Environment? Yeah, I thought environment and protecting the barrier reef were one of the same. Lifting job seeker payments? Sure. Renters, rent assistance, high-speed rail, airlines, I think that was about a duopoly. The NBN, don't know what's happening there. Social media, yeah, I guess aged care. So that's the list, that's the analysis done by the Guardian newspaper of all of the important issues that are not being covered in this campaign. Guess what doesn't appear? Defence, or AUKUS, or the US relationship, or the international rules-based order basically falling effing apart. This is just so parochial, I could just scream. In fact, I'm going to pause it here, and I am going to go and scream. Well, that feels so much better, because this parochialism, and it comes about because news editors all across the country have convinced themselves, and politicians in turn, that the only thing that people care about is the so-called cost of living crisis, and we can just ignore everything else that's going on in the world. So this is despite Donald Trump betraying Ukraine, Chinese warships circumnavigating Australia, and more recently talk about whether or not Russia asked Indonesia if it was okay to station bombers on an island 1,300 kilometres from Darwin. None of this seems to be affecting the debate at all about defence, national security and international relations. It is just so frustrating. Now, the big picture, in case people, you wouldn't hear anything about what's going on in the United States if you just relied on the Australian media, so I'm going to say a few words to hopefully help put people in the picture. And Trump's trade war with China will have to end because of the catastrophic damage it will do to the US economy. The US buys around $1 trillion worth of stuff from China every year. That's $1 trillion Australian dollars worth of stuff. Even though there have been some exceptions for things like mobile phones, there's still a basically two-way trade embargo in place. China has returned Boeing commercial aircraft. The consequences of this are already being felt in the United States, and they are going to be horrific. I'm sure they're being felt in China as well, but China is a dictatorship. It's one-party rule. It's a different environment. Let's just look at some practical metrics. Container arrivals in the big West Coast ports of the United States, containers from China, this is, are down between 25% and 45% already from 12 months ago. The number of trucks leaving ports are down 25% on the same time last year, and within days, this will reach 50%. There are twice as many ship cancellations from China as there were at the start of COVID. If this continues for just another 3 or 4 weeks, it is estimated that there will be 500,000 job losses in California alone. Now, maybe President Trump doesn't care because California is a Democrat voting state. But you can see just from these facts, and they are facts, it's not my opinion, this is actually what is happening. This is a disaster for the United States, and no amount of rubbish from the Trump administration about factories moving back to the United States will change the situation. It is clear that President Trump doesn't have a clue about how international trade works or how tariffs operate. I am one of the first to say that President Trump has many skills. I just don't believe reading is one of them. Yet this is the person that many Australians, well, many Australian politicians, Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton, believe is 100% trustworthy on matters of national security. The situation is completely ridiculous, but here we are. Now, I'm going to wrap up with a late developing story and the abject failure of the government to transfer M1A1 main battle tanks to Ukraine. This was an offer made more than 6 months ago. It follows on, of course, from the destruction in secret and at breathtaking speed of 46 modern Taipan utility helicopters. What a record of failure when it comes to supporting Ukraine, though that's not to ignore the fact that some equipment has been successfully donated, but the failures are catastrophic. Now, on the big picture, clearly a vast majority of Australians want to see more support for Ukraine. The polls show the number is around 90%. It's an absolutely amazing figure that 9 out of 10 people can agree on that view. A similar percentage of Australians think that Donald Trump is untrustworthy. Now, just for a moment, setting aside the ethics and the importance of doing the right thing, wouldn't you think that this close to an election, our leaders would be trying to maximise their voter appeal? In which case, they would be doing two things simultaneously: increasing Australia's aid to Ukraine, while at the same time distancing themselves for Trump. Both moves would be extremely popular, but they aren't happening for what seems to be political and moral myopia. It's hardly surprising that both Labor and the Coalition are struggling to achieve much more than 30% of the primary vote on the part of Australians. I'll just conclude by saying, whoever makes up the next government, let's hope they finally get serious about national security before it's way too late. Thank you very much for listening, and the next time you hear from me will be after the May 3rd election. We will have a pretty good idea of who is going to be in a position to form the next government, so let's have a chat about that. Goodbye for now, thank you for listening, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.